I pulled into the parking lot at 3322 South Memorial Parkway. I unlocked the door and entered building 200, walked in, turned left, and went down to suite, technically room 231. This was the control center for Jones LPC and Youth Resources. I had rented this little room in July of 1997 and opened up my private practice in January of 1998. I'd been in that office for a number of years, and there, hanging on my door, was a small rope. Now, ropes are nothing new or odd in the world, which is things Jones. I have ropes in my house. I have ropes in the garage. I have ropes in the truck. I have ropes hanging in the yard. Ropes are so common at our house that we just expect everybody knows how to use ropes. And we run into somebody who doesn't know how to tie knots, we think it's weird, strange, or odd. I came home this one day and Lonnie Beth is in the yard with two of her friends. And as I get out of the truck, she announces, "Dad, we have to hang Holly in the backyard." I needed to know what Holly was guilty of and why she was going to be executed in our backyard. And I thought maybe we should have a trial first. Turns out that that's exactly what they were studying in school, were the Salem witch trials. And they wanted to reproduce a witch hanging. I thought the way you dealt with witches was to burn them. She's a witch, burn her. But as it turns out, they had learned historically that they were hanging witches. Well, I had hung some people before, not execution style, but I've used ropes to suspend people, doing all kinds of things. In fact, the particular thing that we were going to use on Holly, I had used using a chest harness and a seat harness to create a dorsal attachment. This is where you attach the rope in the back. I've used a back attachment at my waist to Australian rappel. I rigged up a chest harness and a seat harness so I could go down a zip line and fly like Superman. We even tested dorsal attachments on our giant swing. We were at Maywood Christian Camp one year, and this was before Maywood had developed the top of the hill, and they would walk the children up this trail to the top of this little rise and build a campfire and tell spooky stories. Well, Mark Ingram and I did not go up to the top of the hill, and we did not attend the campfire. What we did was we stayed behind, and I put a chest harness on Mark and attached him to a seat harness. And then we covered all the rope rigging up with an old military field jacket. And then I threw a rope over a tree limb, and Mark climbed up into the tree, donned his hockey mask, and brandished his large Bowie knife. And as the children came back down the trail from the spooky stories, they had this apparition swing out and float in front of them. It took us 45 minutes to round up all the terrified children from the dark. Note to self, don't swing people out of trees at Christian camp and frighten children after they've already been frightened by stories. Anyway, this is the same technique we're going to use with Holly. I took a little piece of webbing, made an endless loop, turned it into a figure eight, slipped it over the shoulders, clipped it to the front. You put a carabiner in the X, which we call in climbing the magic X. That way it is self-equalizing. We covered Holly with her black witch's robe, attached a rope to the Tower of Terror. The rope ran down underneath her shirt, and then we put a mock noose on her neck, and she climbed up on top of the ladder. Lonnie Beth lay on the ground with her video camera, framing the scene perfectly with this old utility pole sticking in the background. And as we waited for a buzzard to fly over, I kicked the ladder out from under Holly, and she was suspended via the chest harness and the seat harness, and apparently they made a good grade on their school project. So we've used ropes at all kinds of stuff at our house. I use ropes to climb. I use ropes to teach. I use ropes to solve problems, to move heavy objects, to drag deer, to make little men. You get the picture. Ropes aren't unusual in my world. I bought ropes in a bag. You can buy a 60-meter length of rope for climbing. You can buy a standard 150 foot of rope for rappelling. I bought rope by the foot, and I bought it by the roll. When I worked at the Davis Clinic, my friend Julie Shank Brown had a friend who worked for PMI. PMI is Pigeon Mountain Industries. Two of the largest rope manufacturers in the world are actually in Georgia. PMI at Pigeon Mountain, Georgia, and Blue Water Ropes in Carrollton, Georgia. And Julie said, "Hey, my friend at PMI says they're running this special, and I can get you some dynamic climbing rope for 40 cents a foot." And that was unheard of. So I said, "Look, we've got to re-rope all the things, all the elements we use on the ropes course on Kill Mountain." And our policy on Kill Mountain was that every year that when we re-roped the course, everything that was life support was the same color. So if you opened up a box and you saw, a blue rope or a red rope, you knew that this season's safety color was blue, not red. The reds were retired. We'd use them to drag tree limbs or whatever. And so we always put all the ropes were all the same color. And in order to rope the ropes course on Kill Mountain, we needed 540 feet. Well, that's a substantial saving when you're buying rope in the bulk. And so I said, hey, I need 540 feet of this 40 cents a foot rope. If you ever get discount on a rope, always ask, what color is the rope? Because when my rope arrived at my house, I knew that for the next 3 years, I was going to have to live with and work with 540 feet of glow in the daylight pink rope. Anyway, I bought the pink rope and we used it. I still have some hanging around. It's a blight on my reputation that a guy like me uses pink rope. But I've got this little white rope hanging on the doorknob at my office, and it has a note. And I'm getting a stalker vibe off this maybe, but I walk up and I pull the note off, and the note said to this effect: to knot tying expert, Lonnie. In 1989, a girl at Auburn tied this knot on the two ends of my Auburn workout sweats top. I've left it tied with this knot all these years. Do you know what knot this is? There are two of them tied in this line, and then it was signed by the knot questioner. So after reading the knot note, I realized I'd actually seen this knot. I'd actually used this knot. In fact, I just taught this knot at a camp at Berry College the Thursday before. Now, the knot we're talking about is that little knot you use at summer camp to make lanyards. You use that little plastic material. And the art form or the plastic material, I come to find out, was called Scooby-Doo. Scoubidou, not the dog that eats snacks, but this is a little plastic lanyard cord called Scooby-Doo. In the United States, they're called boondoggles. And the knot in question is the basic knot you use for making these little crafts at camp, and it's called a square stitch. Now, the interesting part of this whole thing is that a square stitch can be tied with two independent pieces of line. So you got maybe, a 2-foot section and a 2-foot section, and you lay them at perpendicular angles and you fold them over each other. The knot that this guy had reproduced was reproduced out of a single line. And you've really got to have 4 free ends to do this. And the girl who had tied this knot in his hoodie had somehow tied this thing that you need to have 4 free ends, and she'd done it using only 2 free ends. And he kept this knot in his hoodie for over 20 years, and apparently he had studied it without knowing what it was, without knowing what it was used for, and he'd reproduced it on this piece of cord so that he could talk to me about it. He'd had it from 1989 to 2011. He was reproducing it, but he couldn't identify it. Lots of people are walking around with unidentified things and putting knots in their sweats or twist in their knickers, if you will. We all get knotted up from time to time. And we get knotted up over different things. But what do we do with these knots? I think it's important to be able to identify the knots. I think it's a good question. This guy finally, after all these years, says, hey, I've got this thing that's knotted up in my sweats, and I want to know what it actually is. And I want to know what it's actually used for. There's an old diagnostic adage that states, in order to tame the beast, you must name the beast. It's necessary to know what we're dealing with. In dealing with emotional intelligence and being able to identify our emotions is super important. The subtle difference between anger and frustration. Understanding that a lot of people who feel really, really aggressive or really, really angry, and teenagers, they're often just scared or insecure. But being able to look at these things that have been knotted up in our lives for a long, long time, it's probably important to be able to actually put a name and why did they say that? Did they say that to hurt me or did they say that to help me? Did they do that on purpose or was it unintentional? And if we can name those things and understand why those knots are there, maybe we can tame those things. The interesting thing about knots is that once they get left in a line or left on a rope and the more pressure you put on them, they tend to get set. And knots that get set don't come out very easy. And maybe knots get set in our lives and we're afraid to take them out because we don't want to forget what was done to us. Maybe we're afraid we won't remember how it was done to us. Or maybe if we forget how it was done to us, we'll invent new ways to do the same things to others. You see, I would call that unfinished business. And there's lots of things said in the wisdom literature about unfinished business. There's lots of stuff about dealing with our trauma. Lots of things about going back and asking, hey, do these things have meanings to me, and are those meanings valid? When the Apostle Paul writes to the churches, he'll say several things about unfinished business. Number one, he'll say, owe no man anything but to love. You see, forgiveness is not about what you owe me, it's what I owe you. And what I owe you is to untangle that knot, untie that knot, and let it go. Paul also admonished, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. Don't take these knots to bed with you and sleep on them and keep them set and keep them tied. You see, when we have these knots and we don't know what they're used for, we don't know what they're called, but we reproduce them and we continue to talk to other people about them, that sounds like a perpetual cycle to me. That perpetual cycle is actually addressed in Scripture as well when Paul says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You don't repay evil with evil, you overcome evil with good. And I'm not really sure what has us all knotted up. But here's what I've learned about knots and their functionality. I was at a camp one time with my friend Tim Oberson. We're going to take the kids rock climbing, and in the preparation for rock climbing, I was going to teach them how to tie some knots. Turns out everybody doesn't think tying knots is as cool as I do. But I was going to teach them to tie knots, and so we're doing some pretty simple knot stuff. And Tim came over and said, hey, I like to know the purpose of the knot before I learn to tie it. You see, it helps me remember not only how to tie it, but when to tie it if I know why it is tied. I can't really use it if I don't have some application for it. You see, if the knot doesn't have a purpose, why is it still there? That's a good point, Tim. Maybe rather than learning to tie a knot, we need to learn to untie a knot. Now, there are some knots that are part of us. They don't necessarily become our identity, but they're a part of us. One of the interesting things about ropes and knots is that when you put a knot in a rope, the rope actually gets weaker, not stronger. Now, there's some specific technical details, like a figure 8 knot will retain 89% of the rope's efficiency. But for practical purposes, you get out into the field and you're talking about using something as a rigging point or an anchor or suspension, we're just going to safely say, hey, when I put a knot in this rope, I've reduced the strength of this rope by 50%. That's what we use in field applications. Well, you mean when I put a knot in this rope, I'm going to make the rope weaker? Yeah, well, I'm not going to put a knot in it. Okay, then how are you going to use it? You see, a rope without a knot's not very useful. Knots are created in ropes so they can hold things. Knots are created in ropes so they can hold you. And if your job is to hold the rope and let the rope hold you, you're not understanding what the function of the rope is anyway. The very same thing that makes the rope vulnerable also makes it functional. And if I end up with a knot in my life, it's not my identity, but it has a purpose. It has a function. The same thing that makes the rope vulnerable makes it functional. Now, there are things in our lives that look like knots, and they're not. They're just tangles. You see, if you don't know how to coil a rope and you store it in a bag, you store it in a box, you keep it in your toolbox, when you pull it out, that thing that you pull out is not a knot, it's a tangle. Now, there are knots in tangles, but they're not there intentionally, and therefore they don't have a purpose. Back to Tim's point, why is this there? Why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? And so learning that the knots in our lives have a function, the very same thing that makes us vulnerable makes us functional, that's different than dealing with a bunch of tangles. And if you've got tangles in your life, they don't function as knots. They function as chaos and confusion, and they don't make you functional, and they make you vulnerable. And something that makes you vulnerable and dysfunctional is not a knot, it's a tangle. Reproducing a tangle doesn't do much good. But untying a tangle, taking the knots out of a tangle before they get set, that frees the rope. And a freed rope, a rope that is free, can be used for tying knots for a purpose. And that's very different than keeping knots on purpose.